We're about to jump into 4 back-to-back hours of really superstar panels. And the first one here is going to run from 1:30 to 2:30. It's going to be chaired by Robert Enlow. So Robert, if you and your fellow panelists will start coming online and opening up your microphones and your videos as you come onto the virtual stage. For this first hour, the focus is going to be opening up the private sector, particularly to students from disadvantaged backgrounds. We should have 15 minutes at the end of this panel for audience Q&A. Again, if you're watching or listening in, please type the questions into the Q&A feature. I'll pose a few at the end. I think we've gotten to about 80% of questions so far. I know we missed a couple of panelist questions there in the last session, but we've gotten to about 80% of audience questions so far. A reminder to everyone that we are recording today's events, and that means these next 4 panels will be recorded as well. We introduced you to Robert Enlow this morning, but as a reminder, he is the overall co-host and co-leader of this conference with Professor Peterson. Before the establishment of EdChoice in 2016, Robert was an integral part of the Milton and Rose Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice from its founding in 1996. He served in various roles: fundraiser, projects coordinator, vice president, executive director, prior to being named president and CEO of the foundation in 2009. Robert, good to see you again. It's been a couple hours, and you and your panel are up.
Thank you so much, CR, for having us again. And I cannot believe how nice it is to be with this group of people, many of whom need no introduction. But I'll do it briefly anyway before we jump into a set of questions about our panel, which is opening up the private sector to the disadvantaged as we continue the conversation about creating educational opportunities. So I'm joined, of course, by Albert Chang from the University of Arkansas, who has been very involved in understanding the data and the impact on children, particularly disadvantaged children, from school choice programs and from opening up the private sector. I'm joined by Jason Bedrick, the EdChoice's Director of Policy, who is a leading national expert on the many different types of EdChoice, school choice that have been out and about in the last 25 years. And last, but certainly not least, my good friend, Justice Clint Bolick, who is now on the Arizona Supreme Court. And I remember days back in the old days of Milwaukee, finding bars in Milwaukee with then lawyer Clint Bolick at the Institute for Justice. So it's an esteemed panel, and we're excited to have them. So we're going to talk about 5 things in particular, and I'll ask 5 sets of questions and then take it out to the panelists. First, we want to look at the progress of how the private sector has opened up to the disadvantaged, the impact of how the private sector has done as it has opened up to the disadvantaged, the legal ramifications and the legal challenges that have been faced along the way and the future of those, and then the practice of how the private sector has done well or not well, and then we want to end with a theoretical question about private sector in general. So why don't we just start for those who have been involved in this movement for such a long time. I know Justice Bolick and Jason. How has the private sector actually opened up to the disadvantaged in the last 25 years? What has it done, and how has it achieved an opening up for low-income students?
Who would you like to go first, Robert?
Go ahead, please. You, sir, first.
Well, first of all, two preliminary things. You forgot to tell me that I could dress down for this, Robert. And second of all, I see Milton in the background there with a mask on. Do you really think that he would be complying with these edicts?
I make no comment on that.
Well, it's so great to be with everyone virtually. I really want to thank the other panelists from throughout the day for their incredible work in education reform. This is, I think, a tremendous crossroads right now, where we have tremendous momentum for school choice, including people who certainly were hostile only a few months ago, who are now potential allies because of the circumstances. At the very same time as I think the empire is really striking back and fighting to not only resist further forms of choice, but actually roll back much of the progress that we have seen in recent years. I guess I would offer two comments on this first question. The first is, of course, even before the school choice movement got rolling in the 1990s in a significant way, there was a tremendous structure of private schools that were focused on offering high quality educational opportunities to disadvantaged people. In fact, some of our greatest Black and Hispanic leaders in particular today were educated in those private schools, and they continue to provide outstanding educational opportunities. What we saw in Milwaukee and elsewhere was that once low-income kids had the resources at their command, the private sector responded, and there was tremendous growth both among religious schools, especially schools that were able to open in churches where the facilities were vacant every day except for Sunday, as well as the nonprofit sector, the secular sector, which had for the first time the opportunity to provide growth. I know that a number of religious private schools in the inner city, which have been under tremendous stress and strain in the last couple of decades, they're closing in a large number of cities right now at the very time when we need those educational life preservers the most. And so I think that presents a tremendous challenge to those of us who support as many educational opportunities for disadvantaged kids as possible. But the real growth has come outside of traditional schools. And one of the things I'm excited about as the movement has evolved, school vouchers, which of course I spent a tremendous amount of my litigation career championing, what they do is fantastic, but also extremely limited. And that is that they allow kids to go from one set of bricks and mortar schools to another set of perhaps better bricks and mortar schools. And school choice and the private sector opportunities that are available are far greater than bricks and mortar schools. In the 21st century, we have the capacity technologically to provide highly personalized educational opportunities to every kid in America at a fraction of the cost that we're spending right now. And we're seeing with the advent of education savings accounts, which allow parents to personalize their spending on education, that the private sector is responding. Just to put this into perspective, and I'll allow others on the panel to talk in greater detail about specific opportunities that are available. But even before I got involved in school choice, when I was a brand new lawyer in the 1980s, I was providing pro bono services to homeschoolers. And at that time, such a short time ago, relatively speaking, homeschoolers were still going to jail because they were considered to be truants. And I remember delving into what these homeschoolers were doing in Colorado. And there were no resources available. You could mail away for some homeschooling curricula from religious organizations, but really the parents were largely left to fend for themselves. Boy, how things have dramatically changed now, where not only are a whole host of private companies from Khan Academy to charter schools offering virtual services to private enterprises providing specialized educational services and services for disabled kids, but even the public sector is getting involved, especially in the post-secondary sector, providing opportunities for virtual learning. A number of colleges have recognized that the potential for them to be involved in this. So we're seeing an absolute explosion now. And I think in this year, 2020, we're going to see an even bigger explosion. And I think it's never been easier for families to access high quality private sector educational opportunities. But unfortunately, public policy is lagging far behind that possibility.
Jason, talk a few minutes about the public policy and how it's changed since in the last 25 years from a straightforward voucher to where it is today.
Sure, absolutely. To your original question, I was going to say, as Justice Bullock noted, most private schools, especially those that have a religious mission, offer some sort of financial aid, which is great, but it's not enough. So EdChoice's annual Schooling in America survey consistently finds that about 4 in 10 parents say that they would prefer to choose a private school for their child, and yet fewer than 1 in 10 actually do. Hence the need for educational choice. In the early 90s, we started with the modern advance in school choice. So there are some school choice programs really that go back to the mid 1800s, particularly town tuitioning programs in Maine and Vermont. But we started to focus on vouchers in the 90s, and then soon thereafter tax credit scholarships, which are very similar to vouchers, but privately funded and incentivized through the tax system. Starting around 2011, though, we had several states adopt education savings accounts. So in these cases, unlike a traditional voucher, which is just a set amount of money that goes to a family that they can use for private school tuition, the ESA allows the family to use, they can use it on tuition, but also for other educational expenses like tutoring, textbooks, homeschool curricula, online learning, and then the funds roll over from year to year. So we really have seen a shift over the last decade from school choice to educational choice.
I think that's right, and we're seeing even greater shifts as a result of the pandemic. So one of the things about opening up the private sector is you actually need to find out if it works. And I think we've had 25 years of debate and discussion and evidence on how private school choice and on how the private sector has worked for disadvantaged students. So I want to bring in Albert here and say, Albert, answer that question. How has the private sector been working? What has been the impact to the disadvantage of all of these private sector programs and the opening up of the private sector?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I think if you think about the kind of 3 kinds of forms of private school choice we've had that Jason just outlined. So we have vouchers, and then the newer forms, tax credits and education savings accounts. We certainly know a lot more about vouchers since they've been around. And Paul himself, was part of one of the early studies of this. It's a New York City program that offered vouchers for low-income kids to go to private school. And generally, if you look at that study itself, the test score gains are kind of, null to maybe positive for certain subgroups of students, and larger attainment gains. So going to college and graduating from college, those effects are a lot bigger. So in general, I'd say that at least my characterization of the research of that study and others, if you look at other high quality random assignment type studies, is of the earlier programs, null to positive test score results, and then slightly more positive educational attainment results. Now we got to be honest here. If we look at some of the more recent programs that are out there, like the Louisiana Scholarship Program, some of the more recent analysis of the voucher program in DC, we're actually seeing some negative test score results as well, and some null kind of attainment results there. So, we've got to take a full picture here and be honest with it. At the same time, I think we'd ought to emphasize here that I think if you ask most people what they want out of education, it's not just getting kids, numerate and literate and ready for a job to make money. I think a lot of folks, if you ask most parents, or certainly if you survey a lot of parents, they care about the civic formation of their kids, social formation, the formation of good character. I suppose if you think about everything that's going on these days with the pandemic and are having to, deal and wrestle with issues of race, that literacy and numeracy and being employed might do a little bit there, but really at the end of the day, I think the kind of society we want to build requires people of good character, people that are kind and caring, neighborly, self-sacrificing. So, we have to think about what private schools do on these fronts too. And let me just really quickly mention on that front, there's a study that my colleague Pat Wolf just released about the Milwaukee program that Clint was involved with there, finding kids that participate in that program, were less likely to get involved in the criminal justice system. So crime rates went down. Some of my own work suggests greater civic engagement, higher rates of volunteering, charitable giving, belonging to social networks, talk about social isolation being a big problem these days among our children. And we have some evidence that the private school kids are turning out, I suppose in a little bit better shape in those regards. So, I'll I guess leave it at that. Certainly parental satisfaction obviously is a big winner here for private school parents. So lots more to talk about, but I do want to leave time for all the other issues we can address here.
That's great, Albert. Jason, follow that up with, one of the things we've said a lot of times, or it's been said about school choice, is that it hurts public schools, traditional schools, that there's a problem with that. Does the data back that up from your perspective?
No, it does not. And this is a question that comes up over and over, and certainly, the story that is told makes sense intuitively. If you have educational choice, it could be that the best and brightest students are going to leave, that the families that are the most interested in education are going to leave the system, and then the system is going to be left with less money and with the most difficult students to educate. But the research, by and large, has not found that. There have been 27 studies that look at the competitive effects of school choice. 25 found positive effects. I mean, these are not transformational, but they are small, statistically significant positive effects. One found no visible effects, and one found modest negative effects. But by and large, that's what we're seeing. And we have some longitudinal data from Florida to back that up as well. What Florida has done, they have random assignment, well, not random assignment, so they have a national standard tests that they're using in Florida. They don't use the state tests, but you can choose from a menu of nationally norm reference assessments. And then one of the universities in Florida every year is doing an assessment of those. And what they're finding is that the students that are entering the program have lower standardized tests on average when they enter the program, which is to say that it's not the cream of the crop. It's not the students that are thriving, that are doing really well in the public school system, that are leaving to take a scholarship and go into the private school system. And I should mention, Florida has the largest tax credit scholarship program in the country. They've got 100,000 students participating, and these students are very disadvantaged and low income. They tend to be from, I think the average family income is only $25,000, and about, I think between 7 and 8 out of 10 are African American or Hispanic. So this is a disadvantaged population. But even more so, even these students, when compared to their demographic peers in the district schools, are less advantaged going into the system. And yet after a few years of receiving a scholarship, they're performing at about the national average, which is to say they are outperforming their demographic peers.
Robert, if I could jump in there, this is really anecdotal, but here in Arizona, I think that we've seen positive competitive effects of school choice programs, both charter schools and private school choice on Arizona public schools. We're finally, after a long time, moving the needle in a positive direction in terms of overall education performance in Arizona. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that public schools have the capacity to respond to these competitive pressures. And that's very, very important. If they are completely shackled, we're probably going to see some negative effects in the public sector. But just two anecdotes that I brought a smile to my face. And my daughter's in a traditional public school, so I am really, really pulling for this to be a net positive all the way across the board. But when Great Hearts Academies opened a campus in Mesa, suddenly the Mesa Public Schools opened a Great Books school within the public school system as well to compete directly with Great Hearts. But my favorite was our very own neighborhood school here. Several years ago, two charter schools opened within only a few miles of this school, and both of them were core knowledge schools and performing very, very well. And I'll never forget when I drove past our neighborhood public school, there was this massive banner that says, core knowledge coming soon. So I think that part of the school choice movement's mission has to be to give public schools the capacity to respond to these competitive changes.
I couldn't agree more. And I think as we've learned, the private sector and the charter sector are opening up options and having an impact positively for disadvantaged kids. I guess the question to you, Clint, would be the following. Wouldn't that have meant that we have a yellow brick road in the legal term instead of a rocky road, or has it been a rocky road legally? I mean, what have been the legal challenges that have faced the private sector as it has gotten involved in providing publicly funded education?
Well,
and where does that stand now?
Many years ago, and I'm sure you remember me saying this, Robert, I said, one way that you can tell whether you've affected systemic change is whether you get sued or not. If you don't get sued, you probably didn't accomplish very much. And that's been a constant in the education reform terrain, and certainly where any sort of private school choice program has been involved. And some of the cases have not turned out well. Of course, with the victory in Zellman versus Simmons-Harris in 2002, the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which was, of course, the major obstacle that we had to surmount, was surmounted. But we have not one constitution, but 51 constitutions, which I love to talk about because generally speaking, I am a big fan of state constitutional protections. And they have what my old litigation nemesis, Robert Channon, used to call a bag of tricks that can be used to thwart school choice programs. Every constitution is a little different. Of course, the main one was the Blaine Amendments, which were designed at the turn of the 20th century, before the turn of the 20th century, to thwart any effort to provide Catholic school options to children. At the time that the schools were Protestant monopolies. And they were adopted in 36 states, and they prohibit any sort of public assistance for the aid or benefit of religious schools. We had to overcome these Blaine Amendments pretty much everywhere that they existed. And in some instances, including Wisconsin, we were successful in doing that. The courts basically said, hey, this is not aid for the benefit of religious schools, it's aid for the benefit of students. But other states, including Arizona, took a narrower approach and said, sorry, this is aid that goes to religious schools and therefore is unconstitutional. Our voucher program here in Arizona was struck down, although education savings accounts subsequently were upheld because they can be used anywhere, including public schools. But in any event, the Institute for Justice kept this effort up to oppose Blaine Amendments and presented the issue to the US Supreme Court in the most recent term. in a case called Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue. And there, the state created a very, very modest tax credit scholarship program. And the state interpreted its Blaine Amendment to require that religious schools be excluded from this program. And other states like Vermont have taken a similar position. And the Montana Supreme Court responded by saying, okay, that means you can't have a program at all. We've solved the problem here. Now there's no discrimination. But the US Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, said that Blaine amendments cannot be used to discriminate against religious options, that once a state has established an aid program in which private schools can participate, that aid must be available on equal terms to religious and non-religious participants. So that is the latest significant legal event. This does not mean that Blaine amendments are unconstitutional. Quite the contrary. There's still a Blaine amendment on the books in Montana, and it has not been disturbed in any of the states that have Blaine amendments. But rather, the principle of non-discrimination was established. So I saw that the Institute for Justice just filed a lawsuit in Vermont where there is a tuitioning program that's been around for well over 100 years, I believe, and it excludes religious schools from participation. But the court did emphasize, especially in a concurring opinion by Justice Alito, which is the first time I've ever seen a cartoon used in a Supreme Court opinion, and Alito would have been the last justice I would ever expect to use it. But it was an old cartoon around the time of the Blaine amendments showing Catholic priests as alligators devouring young school children, and it illustrated the anti-Catholic origins of the Blaine amendments. U.S. Supreme Court's very, very well aware of them, and I suspect now state Supreme Courts interpreting their own Blaine amendments will certainly take into account that history as well. So is that still an obstacle? Certainly so. And there are other state constitutional provisions that may provide obstacles as well.
So that's super interesting. We're now in a situation where after 25 years of opening up the private sector to the disadvantaged, we have 65 school choice programs around the country. They are serving families for the most part very well and certainly helping society, and they're growingly seen as funding following families to whatever school type or school mechanism or learning mechanism is legal. So we've been having this conversation about the actual practice. So let's turn to theory real quick for all of you, because I want to ask this question. So great, we have private schools. So what? Do we actually have a robust private sector in education? And why not? And if so, why? And if not, why not? Because we've been talking about the actual school choice programs that have been out there, but do we have a robust private sector or not? Let's start with you, Justice.
Well, I think that it depends on how you define that. If you define it just as private schools, it's not particularly robust, but I think that depending on public policy, the market has been shown to respond to opportunities when kids have the resources to use them there. If you're talking about educational technology and the delivery of educational technology, not only directly to families, which is phenomenal, but public schools now are using private technology to decrease their costs and enhance their educational offerings. I've never seen such a robust private sector in that regard. And I think as we make resources more transportable, if that happens, we're only going to see a further proliferation of that private sector.
Albert.
Well, to not answer your question, but to pose a different question is, do we have a robust sector anywhere? I don't think anybody looking at any sort of sector of education would be satisfied with the state of things. And so, for me, it's my view is that, look, this is an all hands on deck type issue. I mean, if we want to really improve educational outcomes, address, the social gaps and inequities and opportunity and outcomes, we've got to look everywhere. And so, personally for me, I like to say that all education is public education, because all sectors kind of contribute to the public good in some way. And so, sure, you can quibble about a lot of things with the private sector. My own view is that a lot of the issues that plague the private sector also plague every other sector. I mean, you could talk about segregation and unequal access within the sectors. It's a problem that's common to all of us. And for me, it's let's figure out ways to empower each sector. But I don't know, I suppose I could pick on specific issues if you want. I mean, we can get to that, but maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Jason.
Yeah, and I would say it's not particularly robust yet. And I would point in particular to the Schooling in America survey that I mentioned earlier, where far fewer people are actually participating in the private sector than say they would like to be participating in the private sector. We've seen tremendous growth in school choice programs over there, especially the last decade, but still most of them are very, very small. There's only, I think, a couple of states, Arizona and Florida, that break 5% in terms of the share of students K-12 students who are participating in an educational choice program. So most of the school choice programs really are just filling empty seats, but they aren't large or robust enough to spark a significant supply side response that would expand the private sector or transform it. Although I do think that in Florida and especially Arizona, as Justice Bullock mentioned earlier, we are starting to see that emerge. So in Maricopa County, where I live here in Phoenix, more than 60% of the Arizonans who live here have their children attending a school that is other than their zoned public school, including the largest charter school sector in the country. About 17% of students are attending a charter school. You've got about 8% that are in a private school or homeschooling. And then 30%, and this is an important part of it, 30% that are exercising interdistrict choice. So you may not be able to afford to live in Scottsdale, but you can still get access to a Scottsdale public school education because there are a whole bunch of empty seats in Scottsdale because those families have moved into charter schools or into private schools. That left a gap that has been filled by Scottsdale reaching out into Phoenix and other areas. And those students are now being bussed over to Scottsdale and getting a higher quality education there. That's a very important part of the market.
I couldn't agree more. Let's go on a negative before we go on a positive. Checker Finn says Catholic schools continue to perish by the hundreds. So the private sector, while opening up to disadvantages, is still failing in some ways to actually meet the challenge. What's going on there? Why are Catholic schools, in your opinions, closing by the hundreds? Albert, why don't you start?
Well, look, I mean, resources and money is an issue. And so, with declining enrollments, come, less tuition dollars that are being paid. I mean, certainly a lot, you hear the stories, and there's some evidence bearing out where, parents are opting for charter schools rather than Catholic schools. It's just more affordable, accessible. I mean, you even have some charters, some Catholic schools kind of taking on, becoming charter schools in some sense. So, there is that practical question. Look, I mean, I do think, at least as my own view, that it's an issue that needs to be addressed here. I personally don't want to see the Catholic sector go away. I think they play a really unique place in a lot of neighborhoods and communities. The kind of mission, the social mission that drives them is distinctive. And so I worry about what's lost if that sector goes away. And who knows what's going to happen now, with the pandemic. I know this is a big issue with private schools kind of staying afloat in these times. So, I could only call attention to this right now. I don't have great answers.
Jason.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the pandemic is obviously playing a large role in this. The Cato Institute has been tracking the schools that are closing across the country. And for the most part, they are Catholic schools. But these are schools that are, I mean, Catholic in a lot of states, the majority of students attending Catholic schools, and I'm the product of a good Catholic education. You may have guessed I'm not Catholic, but in most Catholic schools, the majority of students now are not Catholic. They're going there because the parents believe they're getting a better education. The parents believe that they're instilling some sense of discipline. A lot of parents are equally happy sending their kid to a charter school to get those things and not having to pay tuition. And with the pandemic and schools being closed down, and parents sometimes being laid off or furloughed and they don't have the money for tuition, it's been a problem. What we've seen, though, is that Catholic schools are not closing down in Florida and they're not closing down in Arizona, but they are closing down in states that don't have robust educational choice programs. So if we really do care about equity and empowering the least among us, then educational choice is an important element.
So that's interesting you bring that up, and I'll turn this to Clint. Private schools are seen as elite institutions. They're not seen as serving the disadvantaged. That's what they stand for, and that's the myth of that. Is that true from your perspective, or is that actually, even outside of choice, does the private sector actually serve the disadvantaged?
Oh, you certainly know the answer to that question better than almost anyone. And by the way, I appreciate the comment from Checker. I miss you, Checker, and wish we were all together in person. But I used to say early on, I had never set foot in a Catholic K-12 school in my life until I started working in voucher programs in Milwaukee and elsewhere. And it was a transformative experience for me. Most of these schools are overwhelmingly minority. As Jason said, they are majority non-Catholic, and that, I think, is the source of the funding problem. These schools are not serving their parishioners for the most part. They're on a rescue mission. They're on a social justice mission. And that is very, very difficult for an entity to sustain over the long haul. People now, or even more people, are moving out of the cities, and I fear that the situation is going to be even worse. But I used to say that if every American could spend a day in an inner city public school and a day in an inner city Catholic school, we would have no problem advancing the concept of school choice, because people have no idea how bad the situation is for so many inner city parents on a daily basis, where their kids are not only being not well educated, but they're in danger. They're in physical danger. And then how good inner city private schools are, not just educationally, but over the long haul. And just to give one quick anecdote here that has fueled me for decades. It was in Holy Angels School in Chicago, surrounded by some of the worst performing and most dangerous public schools in the entire United States. Many of the people on this conference are probably familiar with Holy Angels and its amazing mission. And the eighth graders, when I toured it, had the honor of guiding guests around, and I had two adorable eighth graders who were showing me around. And we walked into a kindergarten class, and there were about 30 or 35 students, all of them African American, sitting there with impish grins on their faces and their hands folded on their desks. And I thought to myself, there's something odd about this classroom. And then I realized the teacher had stepped out for a few minutes. Now, if the teacher stepped out of my kid's kindergarten class for a few minutes, there would be chaos and pandemonium. But these kids were exercising self-discipline. And that, even if they had to leave the school a few years later due to circumstances that's something they're going to keep with them for the rest of their lives. So when I saw Pat Wolf's study the other day, I'm like, that's exactly right. We are not just looking at test scores here. We are looking at building citizens. We're looking at building responsible, motivated kids with great values. And boy, the answer is emphatically yes. These schools do serve, and they well serve these young economically disadvantaged children.
So I want to end with a blue sky conversation real quick, because I think they do serve children well. But as Albert brought up, and all of you, I don't think we have a robust system at all, right? Whether it's public, private, or charter in many ways, right? There are pockets. There are some great ones. There are some incredible examples like what's going on with Superintendent Carvalho in Miami. There's lots of pockets of great things, but as a whole system, it's not very robust. Our director of national research at EdChoice, Mike McShane, says school choice can serve either to fill existing seats in existing schools, build new seats in existing schools, or build a whole new system. And it's done pretty well on the first part of filling existing seats in existing schools, but not very well on the last part. So what does the private sector need to do, blue sky thinking, to change this, to really become more robust? How should it be thinking? What should we be talking about? For example, should we be talking about schools at all? Should we be talking about public and private and charter as language changes, right? Should we just talk about what families want? What is the blue sky on how the private sector can open up? Let's start with Jason.
Well, I think right now one of the most exciting developments is the move toward micro schools and so-called pandemic pods. I don't like calling them pandemic pods only because this is actually a phenomenon that predates the pandemic. So people have already been doing this. Some call them parent pods, learning pods. They've got 1,000 different names. What we're talking about are usually small clusters of families that are collaborating together and pooling their resources to educate their children. Sometimes they're team teaching in their living rooms. Sometimes they're hiring an instructor. Sometimes they're doing it on their own. Sometimes they're working with some established firms like Alt Schools or Prenda. Prenda is actually a really good example. Prenda was based right here in Arizona. It started in January of 2018 with one micro school with only 7 students. January of this year, so before the pandemic, they had already grown in 2 years to more than 1,000 students in more than 100 micro schools around the state. And they were opening up schools in traditionally underserved populations. In particular, they opened up on the San Carlos Apache Native American reservation. They've been really working with, for example, they recently partnered with the Black Mothers Forum of Phoenix to bring micro schools to primarily Black and lower income neighborhoods. So they are really working on the equity issue. Their goal when I spoke to them in January was that they would double this year by the time schools opened. So they wanted by late August to have 2,000 students. Actually, they had more than 3,500 students. And not only that, they've opened up a new thing called Prenda at Home, which for just a couple $100s a month, you're able to access their platform. And they opened that up nationwide. And so there are hundreds of students additionally nationwide that are participating in that. We've also seen some other states that have been forward thinking on this. So for example, in South Las Vegas, Nevada, they are operating, the district itself is operating micro schools, and they're charging families only $2 a day. And there's still financial aid available to access those micro schools. And then you have groups like, let's say, the National Parents Union that has the homeschool pod grants, Stronger Together ATX, which is in Austin, Texas, community learning sites by the Mind Trust in Indiana, Oakland Reach Virtual Hub, all these different private or sometimes public-private partnerships that are doing their best to provide access to lower income and minority families to these parent pods and micro schools.
So what I hear from you, and then we're going to take questions now and turn it back over to CR, but I hear a change in the way we're looking at delivering education to make it much more blurred, much more public-private partnership, much more focused on bottom-up parents, which is great.
Yes, I should just note quickly, I think the reason they've been growing already before the pandemic is that it allows much more customized instruction. It allows children to go at their own pace. So they're not, if they're ahead, they're not bored. If they're behind, they're not struggling to keep up. They can go at their own pace. And the schools that I visited, the kids just seem so interested and engaged. They're so excited to run over and tell you what they're working on, the various projects and things that they're learning. There are a lot of parents this year. We had a recent survey that EdChoice released with Morning Consult that about half of families have at least considered joining a micro school or parent pod. There are a lot of families that never would have considered an alternative to the public school or private school that they had already chosen, but because of the pandemic, they're exploring other options. And so I think going forward, we're going to see significant change in the sector.
Thank you. Chris, CR.
Hey, Robert. So everyone, just a program note. Superintendent Carvalho of Miami-Dade has joined us. So in about 8 minutes, Superintendent, if you can hear me out there, we're going to pivot to a one-on-one with you and take some questions from the audience on the contemporary crisis. And maybe you can start with an update on today's press conference. So Superintendent, coming your way in just a few minutes. Before we go to Superintendent Carvalho, for this group of distinguished panelists, 2 questions. One is a litany of questions from Professor Peterson. So he wants to know, do we have universal vouchers yet? Should we have universal vouchers? Are education savings accounts now available to everyone? And was it a mistake to focus school choice exclusively on low-income students? So that's Professor Peterson firing the full book at you.
And we have 8 minutes, huh?
You got it.
I continue to think, and I see Milton Friedman glaring at me over Robert Enlow's shoulder. I continue to believe that the priority has got to be on economically disadvantaged kids. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a universal approach toward education. I think that education savings accounts should fund all education, and that if we had public schools that were in a position to get their primary funding from parents and to use it as they see fit, we would have a radical and positive transformation of education in our society. But in terms of priorities, we really have not improved educational performance for disadvantaged kids really very much since Brown versus Board of Education, and that is a horrible tragedy.
Albert, Jason, you want to take a swing at any of those? All of those?
I'll just quote, I forget which, someone had said this in the past, programs for the poor are poor programs. I guess that's political science 101, I guess. So look, I mean, there's this trade-off here, I suppose. We want to have equity concerns and certainly want to give preferential treatment to those with less and those that are needier. At the same time, politically, you need that coalition to sustain the program. And so, we'll have to think about how to navigate that politically. I'm not, I suppose this is why I edge in favor of expanding eligibility for these kinds of programs, to sustain them politically.
I don't remember all 8 questions, but do we have universal vouchers or ESAs? No. There are a few states that have universal eligibility for tax credit scholarships. That includes Arizona, Georgia, Montana. I might be missing a few others, but they are constrained funding wise. So there's still a limit to who gets those. Do we have universal ESAs? No. Should we? I think yes. And did we make a mistake in terms of focusing on lower income families? I agree with both my panelists. I think the goal is primarily of the movement to focus on the most disadvantaged. That has to be I think the core moral reason that we're doing this. But in order to do that, I think the best way to do that is actually to pursue the universal course. We want to have, it's much more politically sustainable to have everybody in one boat. As we mentioned earlier, if you only have these small programs for just the disadvantaged, you end up filling empty seats at existing schools. But if you want that sort of transformation, then you need to have the middle and upper middle income groups in as well. And we don't have that yet. So ultimately, to benefit those who are the most disadvantaged, which is to say the most choice deprived, we need to make choice available to everybody.
Here's a final question for Robert and the panel before we transition. Which state or states are going to be the next state or states to dramatically expand educational choice?
Jason, and I'll answer that.
Well, I think Indiana might be the next one. I mean, Arizona, I think will continue, and Florida will continue. Both those states, I think, are going to continue to be the top for a while because they're already so far ahead of every other state, and they are also, you know, they have systems that are sort of built to expand. Especially Florida, where they have what's called an escalator clause on their voucher that just makes the program expand over time, and with their tax credit scholarship, I should say. Indiana used to be the champion, and I think that there is an opening there for them to again be in the top 3.
Yeah, I would agree with that. From my perspective, I think Indiana to be a homer is definitely on the radar screen. But I think there are other states that are showing some interesting progress, right? So I think what this, and actually we should look at cities. I think what the city of North Las Vegas did, offering microschooling to all of its groups, its kids. What I think I hear Idaho doing today, which is offering microschooling, a huge microschooling program to all of it. So you're going to see states try some new things as a result of the pandemic that are going to take them ahead. So I think Idaho will be one of those. Oklahoma has a chance to be one of those. I still think New Hampshire is interesting in the way it's doing its program called Learn Everywhere, which is really trying to say, how do we get, as Justice Bullock said, just get them the money in the hands, and whether they pay for public school, private school, charter school, or whatever customized schooling they have, it's actually requiring the parent to put some effort into paying. And I think that's making some differences in those states.
Robert, would you bring this panel to conclusion? Go right ahead.
Well, I just want to thank the panelists and especially Clint for being on, and Albert and Jason for being on, and we appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.